launch into our program today, I just want to make everyone aware of the various functions that are available to them. On the bottom right-hand side of your screen, you'll see a little chat box. And it's in that box that you can address any questions to us that you want to during the program itself. If you have any technical difficulties, we will do our best to resolve those during the program itself as well. So please let us know about them by typing them into that box in the bottom right. And there will also be a couple of moments during our presentation today when we'll ask for you to type things into that box with either some questions or ideas or anything else like that. So I hope you all had a wonderful holiday weekend, watched some soccer. This room is very excited about the soccer win yesterday, and we'll launch into our programming this morning. So I have 10 o'clock. Shall we?
Can everyone hear us okay?
Yeah, if
you if you can't hear this question, but an affirmation that you can hear in the chat box would make me feel more confident that
yeah. If someone out there is listening to our voices, can type in that bottom right hand and just give us a thumbs up that you can hear us okay, we'd appreciate it. It's early on a Monday morning. We want to make sure that we're good.
see someone's typing.
Hey!
Excellent.
Great news. Thank you, Lynn. We appreciate it. Okay. Terrific. All right, we are going to get started. I remember you can use that chat box at any point to ask us questions or concerns, and we will be asking for your feedback at a couple of specific points as well. So we are going to start by introducing ourselves, and I'll start by introducing myself and the Vermont Historical Society. My name is Amanda Gustin. I am the Public Program Manager for the Vermont Historical Society. The Vermont Historical Society is a statewide history organization, and our mission is to, it's up on the slide there, we engage both Vermonters and Vermonters at heart in the exploration of our state's rich heritage. Our purpose is to reach a broad audience through our outstanding collections, statewide outreach, and dynamic programming. We believe that an understanding of the past changes lives and builds better communities. And that last sentence is my favorite, and it's really one of the reasons I'm excited to work on this programming in particular that we're doing this summer, and also the content of this webinar today. So as a quick overview of the kinds of things the Vermont Historical Society does that might be of interest or use to you all as leaders or employees of small community organizations. We have a museum in Montpelier and the History Center here in Barrie, where we are sitting today. The museum is what we call our permanent exhibit. It's an overview, a 5,000 square foot overview of Vermont history. It's where we welcome just about every single fourth grader in the state at some point during the year, because it does sit right next to the State House and the Supreme Court building, and they get a good sort of state history and government day out of it. But we also welcome many thousands of members of the general public as well, and we have a couple of rotating exhibit galleries. Here in the History Center in Barrie, we have our administrative offices, but also our collection storage, and by that I mean both our physical objects and artifacts, as well as our research library, which contains both open and closed stacks, rare books, as well as just general Vermont reference books. We are the largest genealogical library in the state, and our collection of Vermont history is pretty much unparalleled. Some of the programming that we do, we support local historical societies and cultural organizations through mentorship programs. We'll pair you with specific people who have skills that match your needs. We also host workshops on a variety of topics that people have told us they're looking for. We can do site visits to do specific critiques of things that you may be questioning or worrying about, whether it's exhibits, storage, accessibility of the building, just sitting down with all of your staff members and doing some succession planning. And we also offer program opportunities in a variety of different forms. One of them is the program that this webinar is part of, which is a series of community conversations tied into the publication of our newest book called Repeopling Vermont. But we do a couple of others. One of those is the next item on our list here. It's a Vermont trivia kit. And you basically, you rent it. There are various levels of fees depending on what level of kit you want. And our hope is that this is the kind of thing that you can do to just have some fun and also learn something about Vermont. We sort of designed it and tested it by going to breweries and pubs and bars around the state and doing it with completely random audiences who had shown up that night, and it went over really well. They're all multiple choice options. We offer a ton of fun prizes with it. It's just a really fun kit. We also have a traveling exhibition program on a variety of topics that we offer as panels, 5 to 6 to 7 panels, depending on the exhibition, that can be on a wall. And generally, they can be sort of self-sustaining. They can be the panels with the information. And some of those we have are on Abenaki agriculture, Solzhenitsyn's time here in Vermont, signs, sports in Vermont. We're working on one right now on the history of the Long Trail in Vermont. But they can also be paired with community objects. We're kind of hoping the Long Trail one gets paired with people from the community who may have hiked the trail. They can bring their own things in, and they can be paired with historic objects. If you're a local historical society, you can pull items out of your own collection to match the topics. So those are available for you if you have interest in borrowing them, and we do also provide support on the installation and the programming, because it's meant to help you, not to just be available and then throw you out to the wolves. We really want to make sure it's a learning process and a supported process. On the topic of exhibition, we also have our local history gallery in Montpelier. Right in the center of that major exhibition there is what we think of as a black box space. It's a completely empty blank room that's available for local organizations to host history-themed exhibitions in 6-month rotations. There's an application process. We support you in sort of developing the exhibition and then installing it. Runs about 2 years in advance, so you got plenty of time to plan for and think about what you might want to do in that space. And it can be a really, really great opportunity to expand some of the things you do, get more eyes on the work that you do, take a particular topic that your organization is passionate about and good at and loves, and bring it to a really broad attention. So we're really proud of that. And we also host every fall an annual day-long conference with sessions on topics for small local heritage and history organizations. And these are generally presented by other leaders of history organizations around the state on everything from here's an interesting way we used Facebook, to here's a new storage system that we developed made out of IKEA parts, to here's how we engaged and grew our membership. It's really a little bit of everything, but our goal is to make them most directly useful and applicable to very, very small, almost always volunteer-driven local organizations, because part of our mission at the Vermont Historical Society is to support local historical societies, community organizations, and heritage organizations around the state. If you want more information on anything I've talked about, and that really, we do a lot more things too. Those are just the things that I thought would be most useful to our audience today. But if you want more information about all of the many other things that we do, you can go to vermonthistory.org. Thank you. I'm going to turn it over to my partner.
Good morning, everybody. This is Joy Warland from the Vermont Department of Libraries. I am the consultant for continuing education and small and rural libraries here at the Department of Libraries. And the mission of the Department of Libraries is defined in statutes, so you can read the statute, the formal language up there, but just to summarize it, we are the library for state government, and we support all Vermont libraries in terms of continuing education and programming, and some financial support in terms of resource sharing. We also have a library, the Able Library for special populations, and we do work with other community organizations as well, an example being this program that we're doing with the Vermont Historical Society. So moving on to the next slide, some of the specific services that we offer. I know some of you are librarians that are on this webinar, so you are familiar with some of these interlibrary loan and the courier system are a big part of it. Continuing education, as I mentioned, we have a certificate for public librarianship for people who are working in libraries but don't have a master's degree. So that's a very big part of our work that we do here. We also do trustee training and governance training for librarians and directors, so they know, make sure that they are following all the correct laws and running their organizations in a healthy, robust way. And we give grants to libraries to do different projects, and some for continuing education as well. And then we have also provide access to Vermont Online Library and free online classes through Universal Class. And there's just a variety of things that we do. This one of the themes of this is resource sharing, trying to make sort of an economy of scale because we have so many libraries, some with quite small budgets, but really trying to do a lot of things. So this, again, this program is an example of how we can support resource sharing in terms of programming. We have book sets related to this program. You can borrow 10 books, 10 copies of the book, Repeopling Vermont, from the Department of Libraries, and use those to fuel your discussion program if you decide to do that. And also we are thinking of this program, to me it seems a good example of sort of modeling the way that public libraries can collaborate with their local historical societies or other community organizations on a local level, because that's how we can reach more people and do more interesting things if we collaborate. So I also want to do a pitch for the trivia kit that Amanda mentioned. It's going to be at the Arsenal conference. So if any of you are coming to the opening reception of the conference in Burlington in September, we are going to have Vermont trivia there at the reception to share with our colleagues from out of state. So that will be very fun.
Great. All right. So we're going to get into the meat of our conversation today. And we're going to model sort of good discussion and content delivery by starting off and giving you a sense of what we're talking about here today. So as we've alluded to, our webinar today is part of a summer of programming based around a new book published by the Vermont Historical Society titled Repeopling Vermont, The Paradox of Development in the 21st Century by Northern Vermont University professor Paul Searls. So at the very end of this program, we'll talk a little bit about sort of how you can get involved in that program, the resources we're providing to support that programming. But the core of what we're going to do today in this webinar can apply to any time that you want to host a conversation at your organization, whether that's a discussion around another book, whether it's a discussion around a hot local topic, whether it's a discussion around another event in history that you think is important or useful for your community to think about. We sort of anticipate that any of these conversations could veer into areas that might make people uncomfortable, that might be a little difficult, but we firmly believe that that's where the good stuff happens. So we wanted to provide this webinar today for you to feel a little more confident in going forward and hosting those conversations. So we're going to cover a variety of topics. We're going to set the stage, tips to consider even before you get to the program itself. We're going to cover something called agreements for courageous conversations, which are things that you can make explicit within your conversation, or that you can just have in your head and your heart as you're embarking on these conversations. We're going to talk about actually sort of on the day of and the moment of how you launch into that discussion and how you set the groundwork for your conversation. We're going to talk about your audience itself. And this is where we're going to answer some of your perhaps some of your questions about how to handle people who talk constantly or who may interrupt or who don't talk at all. Some tips and tactics for actually being in that moment, in that conversation, and sort of supporting the conversation and helping it move in productive ways. And then we're just going to offer some additional wrap-up tips that haven't been covered in the other areas. And at the very end, as I said, we're going to talk just a touch more specifically about the programming that we are offering this summer. So before we launch into the meat of our program itself, we have our first sort of audience participation, and we have a survey for you. we would love to know what is your comfort level, your overall comfort level with moderating or facilitating a potentially difficult conversation at your institution. Is this something that you feel totally 100% confident for? You could be teaching this alongside us, or is this something you are brand new to the entire idea and you feel like you're in the weeds a little bit? So go ahead and click away on an option. This will help us give a sense of how we should be gearing some of the things we're trying to share with people today. Got a nice mix out there. We'll give it just another few minutes to give everyone a chance to weigh in and let us know what your comfort level is. And hopefully your comfort level, whatever it is now, will be higher at the end of our morning together. Let me give it just another little bit and then end voting. So let's call this your last chance to get your answer in before we close our voting. All right. Thanks everyone for checking in with us. So a mix again, that probably a little bit weight on the low or moderate end, which is why you're all hanging out with us on this beautiful Monday morning. Thanks for that. So that's good to know. All right. Close and go back to our presentation here. So now we're going to launch into our program itself with setting the stage, tips to consider before the program.
So thank you all for doing that survey. That is helpful to know, and I'm really glad that people are taking this webinar, especially the people who are less comfortable. I think one of the things that happens with these kind of discussions is you never quite know who's going to show up and what will happen. So part of being prepared is to be prepared to be flexible. Sometimes, especially in a smaller town, you might know a lot of the personalities that show up, but you might not as well. So when you are sitting and seeing people arrive, you have to sort of be filtered in your head things that you think might happen. I'm thinking of some particular people that I know that used to attend programs at the library where I worked. I would sort of have a sense when I saw the room fill up of how the dynamic might be, but you really never know, especially with topics like this that might bring up some issues that are personal and emotional. So one thing that you can do, of course, for something like this that's based on a book, you should read the book first, obviously. You should also be prepared that there will be people there that probably have not read the book or maybe not read all of it, but you as the facilitator want to read the book, and not just because you want to be aware of the topic, but you really want to read it taking notes with an eye toward the fact you're going to be facilitating a local discussion about this. So as you're reading it, if something reminds you of a local issue that's going on, a contemporary local issue, make a note of that, because that might come up, or you might even want to have it as something, if the conversation lulls, you might want to be able to refer back to that. So think about things that, even though this book is primarily about things that happened, some time ago, they're definitely very, very relevant contemporary things. So be looking at that, be thinking about questions that you might want to ask. Are there areas that it touches on that you want to be sure to bring up if someone else in the conversation doesn't bring them up, like something that you feel is particularly relevant, and if someone else hasn't noticed it, that you want to make a note of that. You'll want to ask open-ended questions. Be prepared to ask things that might not necessarily have a black and white answer, because this is not the kind of topic that has that. And although this can feel kind of scary, this is also an area you want to ask for personal opinions. You want to get into that sort of emotional, how does this book make you feel? So, okay. Are you guys hearing me okay now?
Yeah,
okay.
I was trying to resolve the technical difficulty.
Yeah. Okay. So I was just saying that you do want to get into sort of the emotional part of it, because that's the richness of this, and there are going to be differences of opinions, so just be prepared for that as well. And again, you can use the book as a tool. You can refer back to it and use it, like if things slow down or if things get really heated, you can use the book as a tool to, like, let's go back to the text and focus back in that way.
All right. So another thing that you can do ahead of time before your program even starts is to consider inviting new people to your space. One of the reasons to do a program like a community conversation or a discussion or a book discussion is to get new people to come to your institution and to come to meet you. And any particular topic that you want to address, any book, any community topic, anything like that, is going to have different communities of people that it touches upon, and those people are going to have different perspective, different concerns, and just different things to add to the conversation. So if there is a community, a more specific, smaller community within your larger service community that has, whose interests are relevant to your conversation or represented at your discussion, and they're not already people who are coming to your institution, they're not regular visitors, they're not people that you know well or that you think you can reach in the ways that you traditionally or typically advertise your programming, then please reach out to them. Make a phone call, send some emails, do a little bit of networking with people you already know, and say to them, we really want your voice as part of this conversation. We want to hear from you, and we want to talk to you so that we can make this conversation as rich and as complete as we can, and because your voice and your perspective are valuable within this conversation. And then the second part of that is make sure they would feel welcome and safe. We'll talk a little bit about later about not everyone feels comfortable and safe coming to a museum or a historical society or a library. I think a lot of us who work at those institutions have always felt that way ourselves, but I think it's important to remember that there are plenty of people out there who don't necessarily feel that way. So do what you can to make them feel welcome and safe. And we'll talk about some other ways to do that going forward. But sometimes just a verbal "we want you here" is a really big step in the right direction.
Another note about inviting new people and trying to get new audiences in, you don't have to do that all yourself. You can reach out to other community organizations or individual people that you know who might have connections in those communities that you personally don't have, or that might not necessarily read your library website or Facebook page or newsletter. So you can ask other people to ask on your behalf to invite the people of their communities into your programming. So moving on to welcoming them, once you have them there, be sure to thank everyone for coming, obviously. On behalf of your organization and the Historical Society and the Department of Libraries, in the case of these programs, because we are supporting them. Also to the author, especially if he's there, but even if he's not there, for writing the book and spurring these conversations. Thank anybody who has contributed in any way. If people have brought in food, if people have, if you have to have it off-site, if you're borrowing another space, because maybe if you have so many people, they won't all fit in your library, which would be wonderful in that respect. Thank those people. And then a special welcome to anyone who you don't recognize. I mean, don't single them out like that, but to people who haven't been to a library program before, it is important to help them feel welcome and appreciate that they're there and recognize that you're trying to reach out and make the library welcome to people who might not regularly come to it.
So, set expectations before you get started. We often think that people know sort of how these things go. They just have an understanding of how to come to a library or a historical society or a museum and just launch into a discussion. But if we make that assumption, we can get ourselves into some trouble later on. And it can be, again, a lot of what we're going to emphasize over and over again is sort of being kind and thorough and compassionate in the ways that people come to these potentially difficult conversations. And one of the ways to do that is to be really clear about what you're going to be doing together that day, so that no one feels like they're missing out on some unspoken agreement between everyone else. So you're going to lay out your discussion guidelines in specific and straightforward terms, and we'll talk about those 4 agreements in a little bit. But they can also be we're here to have a respectful conversation, and it's important important that no one talk over someone else or things like that. You're going to some extent, you can decide what those discussion guidelines are. But if you're explicit and upfront and specific and straightforward about them, so much the better. Tell everyone how long you expect to be there and what your goals are for that day. We often advertise programs as the timing is either just a start time or it's the totality of the entire time of the entire program. And it can be helpful to people to say, hey, today we're going to hear from the author for about the first half an hour of our time together, and then we're going to spend an hour after that having a conversation. We may not use up that entire hour, but that's the time we've got scheduled for today. And I'll give you guys a heads up as we get to 5 minutes to the end of the hour so we can have some closing thoughts. It's sort of comforting for people to know what's going to happen next in situations. You can also, number 3, I touched on this a little bit with the first one, be upfront about your intention to make sure everyone has a chance to speak. And we'll talk about, whether or not to sort of force everyone to have a talking role. We're not huge fans of the forcing part, but make sure everyone has the opportunity to speak. And you can be upfront about that. And last but certainly not least, make sure creature comforts are addressed. Point out where the bathrooms are, point out where the exits are. If your institution locks the doors at a certain point in time, and if someone goes out to get something from their car and they're going to be locked out of the building, let them know. No one likes that. If the bathroom is in a part of the library that's going to be closed while you're doing the rest of your program, and they'll be able to get to the bathroom, but it's pitch black beyond that's a useful thing for them to know too, so they don't just sort of wander off and get lost in your stacks. If there's food, make sure you point out if anyone has food sensitivities. These things are gluten-free, these things are dairy-free. If you have those options available for people, make sure people know. I'm also a big fan of labeling food personally, so that no one feels like they have to ask. But just taking care of just the basic creature comforts. Bathrooms are here, accessible entrance is here, exits are here. That kind of thing can go a long way towards making people feel more comfortable in your space.
So a lot of what you want to do at this particular program, but really at any program, is to make the library or historical society, this venue where you are, feel welcome and inclusive, because that is a big part of, that's really the mission of public libraries, is to be a place for everybody and a place also for open exchange of ideas. So acknowledge up front that that is part of our mission, and that people need to be aware that they might hear things that they disagree with, and that we're not going to censor what people say as long as they're being respectful and sharing their ideas and listening well to others. But we're actually inviting people, particularly in this program, to say things that other people might disagree with. So just acknowledge that and discuss it up front. Really emphasize the respectful part of it, being a good listener, and that, I just love the idea of going back to the mission of libraries being, this is what we're about, this is free speech. So that's how important it is to us, that it's actually in our missions of public libraries to have these kind of conversations and to be respectful to them, and make sure that everybody has a chance to speak and to be heard. Acknowledge also that there might not be agreement. This is not the kind of thing where there's one right answer. People might come away with different ideas and different perspectives, but they also might come away with still thinking, kind of agreeing to disagree about things. So people come into this with very different ideas, with different backgrounds. This is one that, as I was reading the book, I was very aware of. I haven't really lived in Vermont very long, and sometimes I forget about that, and other times I'm very aware of it. I think that this book is going to, bring that up for people. You're going to have a community of people talking, and some people are going to they're going to introduce themselves by telling you how many generations their family has lived here. And there's nothing that, reminds people that, oh, I've only lived here 10 years. Like people introducing themselves that way. So be aware that that possible tension might be there in this kind of discussion. But that's okay. That's what we're there to bring different people together and listen to those different perspectives. Go through the discussion points ahead of time, again, to try to predict where those uncomfortable areas might be, so you as the facilitator are a little bit more prepared and sort of on alert when it might start to get a little bit tense, and then you can sort of nuance it a little bit because you have sort of given it a thought ahead of time.
All right. So we're about halfway through our presentation today and wanted to open it up. If you have any, at this point, any questions or concerns about anything that we've covered so far, please go ahead and type them away. We'll give you a minute to type up anything and answer them. We're going to use a function where the questions that you type, we'll be able to display them up on the screen. So let me call that up to answer for everyone if you haven't seen it. Our first question, will the slides be available to reference later? Yes, this webinar is being recorded. You will be able to watch the whole thing again. If it is of interest, and please indicate if it is, I have no problem, posting the slides themselves for you guys to download. We will be making a note to do that right now in a PDF. It's important for you also to know that this presentation is based in large part on a program guide that is available right now for download through the Vermont Historical Society's website, and the link to that will be when we talk specifically about the programming at the end of our webinar today. So the content of this webinar is, excuse me, largely available in that program guide as well, but I'm making a note right now to make sure we get you the slides as a PDF. Okay. So if there are no other questions, and I don't see anyone else typing, we will continue. But again, questions at any time are more than welcome. All right, the 4 agreements of courageous conversations. These are, and sometimes there are 4, sometimes I've seen 7, sometimes, these can be just something you sort of think about and hold for yourself while you're getting ready for the conversation. They can sometimes be things that you explicitly state at the beginning of the discussion. It's up to you, it's your program, but we wanted to go over them because we thought they were useful sort of touch points for you to use going forward. The 4 agreements: stay engaged, remain morally, emotionally, intellectually, and socially involved in the dialogue that's in front of you. Super tempting in this day and age to check your phone to sort of get out of a kind of slightly uncomfortable moment, or stare off into the middle distance or that kind of thing. It's hard to stay really thoroughly committed and engaged, especially in a sort of more slightly difficult conversation, but it's important too, because then you get more out of it and you bring more of yourself to that conversation. Right on the heels of that, experience discomfort. And we talked a little bit about this when we talked about, it's okay if you go away without perspectives changed. When topics are challenging, as some of the ones this book brings up and some of the other things you may want to talk about are, they're going to make you uncomfortable. Other people in the room are going to be uncomfortable. And this is one of the ones I think can be of use to talk to people in your group about. Like, it's okay to be uncomfortable. Like, you don't need to feel like perfectly zen and okay about absolutely everything that you're thinking about and talking about today. But we want to talk. We want to have a conversation about these things, even when they may be uncomfortable things, because sunlight is a great healer of all things, and the more that you talk about them, the better it ends up for everyone. Speak your truth. This means being open about thoughts and feelings, and not just saying what you think others want to hear. This can be a tricky one, right? Because your truth may be hurtful to someone else. It may be difficult. So it can be a tricky one to do, but it's important to sort of what your personal truth is, bring that to the conversation. We are by no means saying be hateful, be nasty, but speak your truth. And finally, it goes on again with that experience discomfort, expect and accept non-closure. These are going to be great conversations, and any of the conversations you have in your community are great conversations, but no one is going to solve all the problems of the world in a 1 hour sort of community conversation. You will make headway on them. You will learn new perspectives. You will engage with challenging ideas, but you're not going to fix everything. Over many of these, you may fix some things. That's okay. It's totally okay not to have come to some kind of fix at the end of not some kind of closure at the end of it. The important thing is having the conversation in the first place. So we have some questions and things to address after our slide here. So we're going to switch over to question and answer mode real quick to address those. I'm going to put it up for you.
I think we might want to wait till the end for these because we're actually going to talk about some of these things.
Yep.
And then refer back to them because these questions are great. They're basically they get to the very core of what's challenging about this. Basically, like what do you do when things start to go awry or get difficult? And there are some actual specific tools that we're gonna talk about.
Great.
So yeah, let's.
Great question. I just wanted to let you know, acknowledging your question, Jason, and we will circle back around to it in a little bit. So I've covered the 4 agreements. We're going to move on to facilitating the conversation, and we will have another question break. And if we haven't fully answered your question at that time, please give us a heads up, and we will address it really specifically then. And in the meantime.
Yes, another thing about those agreements, which are really crucial. In some groups, sometimes the people together will create these agreements. That's a little bit awkward if it's a really large group or if you don't have a lot of time, but that can give people a real buy-in to it. And basically, you can sort of, as the facilitator, guide them toward including some of these concepts, but let them come up with their same language. There may be a comfort level of whether people want to talk or not. They might want to decide that individually as the group. And so it might look somewhat like this, but have an individual shape to it. So that does give people like a sense of autonomy in that. So going into introductions, basically it's very helpful if everyone at least says their name and where they're from. I think where they're from is pretty important for this particular discussion because there are so many local issues and every town and community is a little bit different in Vermont, so it's helpful to sort of have that perspective. If you want, you can say, invite them to say why they were interested in coming to this, or you could even have picked a question that you want people to respond to. I'm a pretty strong believer in making that voluntary because some people really don't want to do that and just make it, state up front that it's voluntary so it's not awkward if somebody doesn't want to. So give them that option. It's nice sometimes if people wear name tags, just a first name, so that when you're having a conversation, you can refer back to their name, and then we'll also use that as a tool if somebody is talking a lot or interrupting a lot. It's helpful sometimes to get their attention by saying their name. So that's just pretty basic for people saying hello to each other.
So once you've got everyone sort of saying hello in the space, one way that I really like to launch a conversation is start with a provocative question. One that invites people to make maybe a personal connection, or one, sometimes you can stake a position that is just so patently way out there. For this particular conversation, that may be something like, okay, so we're talking about developing and the conflicts and tension between the human landscape and the physical landscape. Who here votes to raise the historic downtown and put in a strip mall? You can start out somewhere like that. and get people to, even people who may not have thought they had an opinion on that, may have an opinion. Someone may out there be like, you know what? Yes, I would love a dollar store instead of that historic tavern building. Or, whoa, that is exactly the opposite way that I think our community should move forward. It's okay to sometimes stake out that, because it also gives people sort of cover in a way, as something to respond to, and then cover to, oh, okay, well, I do have an opinion about that. I wasn't quite sure what I felt, but now I do. Now I know that's terrible. So I can, I like starting off with that way sometimes. Sometimes that is all you have to do. You start with that, and with some groups, you are off to the races. With some groups, you can, and we'll talk about these going forward, some tactics and techniques to do this, but some groups you may need to sort of continue to prod and continue to move them forward in the conversation.
So another thing you can do to plan ahead, and that will also motivate the conversation if it does start to have a lull in it, is to bring it back to local things. You can plan ahead by reading up your local newspaper, your local media, what's going on in your town, what are some issues that are relevant to this sort of conflict that the book deals with, but that's happening today locally. I'm thinking about, like, I live in Montpelier, there's the seemingly endless conversation over whether we should have a parking garage downtown, and it's obviously it's about a contemporary issue of where people park cars when they didn't even have them, when some of them in the time of this book, but it's pretty much tapping into some of that same thing. Do we innovate, or do we try to keep tradition, and is it going to ruin the spirit of our town if we have something like that? Or the issue with people being paid $10,000 to move here if they're going to work in technology. That's basically pretty similar to bringing some farmers over from Sweden to work land that supposedly was abandoned. There's some similarities there. So what are some issues that are happening currently and locally that might get people talking, even if they haven't read the book, or even if the issues in the book don't speak directly to them? This kind of makes it more personal and more contemporary. One thing that you can do to help with that is to, again, bring in other groups, your historical societies, like your conservation groups, the downtown development groups like that, the Council on Rural Development, that are thinking about these kind of issues all the time. If you can invite someone from there, especially if you have local planning commission, you can bet that those people are thinking about that all the time and might bring in really interesting perspectives that you yourself may not know as much about.
All right, language. This one is a tricky one, but again, it's part and parcel of that, making people feel thoughtful, welcomed, etc. As you're leading this conversation, in your language leading up to the conversation, just be thoughtful and aware of the ways that you can make your language and phrasing welcoming and inclusive. One example might be when talking about families don't automatically assume that a family is a heterosexual couple and their own biological children. When we're talking about development, or we're talking about building a community, new families becoming part of the community is certainly something that might come up. So, it can be easy. It might be easy for you to find yourself falling into, okay, so a dad and mom moving in a community and they have a little girl and a boy that are going to go to our school system, and try to be a little bit more broad and inclusive. I actually noticed in one of our slides earlier, our pronouns. We said him and herself. Them and they is a perfectly acceptable pronoun and can be a more inclusive way to refer to people who are non-binary or choosing different gender expressions. So just think about that. It's a place that I know it can feel easy for me to trip up, but again, this is a space for you to be open and honest, and can talk to your audience a little bit and say, if you feel like I've slipped up on a pronoun, please let me know. Again, this is part of that experiencing discomfort and being willing to learn and gain new perspectives of the conversation. It was also important to both Joy and I to, when we're looking at new audiences, and we were talking about how those audiences might not sort of quote unquote traditionally feel welcomed in a museum or a library space, because they can be big and intimidating. A lot of them may have like columns out front, big front doors that you have to really give a heave to open. Those are just the physical barriers. But people might not always know. If they're new, if they've never been to your space before, they might not understand, or they might not know some of the terms that you use. I mean, if you think about it, check out a book. That's a term that's not universally, if someone hasn't explained to you at some point what it means to check out a book, you might be a little lost. The flip side of that is, read your audience a little bit. You don't need to like condescendingly explain every single term that you use. But if you know that you have people who have never been in your space before, or who you think may not be familiar or comfortable with a library, I'm thinking, for example, that there are a lot of refugee communities in Vermont who may not have experience with the American system of libraries. And Joy, you can back me up on this, but would be tremendously valuable perspectives to have in these conversations. So it can be useful to sort of read your audience, read the audience's body language. If they're lost, try to be a little more explicit in your explaining. If they're totally with you, then you're okay. But it's just really being sensitive and aware of your audience and your conversation.
So moving on to that unruly participant who might talk all the time. There's nothing that derails a dialogue like one person talking all the time. And that's only one of the ways that someone can affect the dialogue. But that particular one, or if they're like talking a lot or going way off topic, one of the things you can do is acknowledge again that the kind of topics that this book brings up and that we're discussing in these community conversations, it has many threads. So you can acknowledge that the tangent that they might have just gone off on is related, but then sort of bring it back to the more core of the conversation. So acknowledge that, what they said, even if maybe it didn't, you can politely, exaggerate maybe a little bit that, I can understand why this made you think of that, but let's go back to the issues in the book. And you can also reference the agreements again if you need to. Just remind people that, remember, we agreed not to interrupt, and we agreed to give everybody a chance to talk. This is a time where if you know the person's name, it might be good to say, hey, Jake, you're talking, I like what you said there. Let's see what other people think about that, which is one of the things Jason referenced in his question, that's a good way to get the conversation moving and also bring new voices in. You can do the sweep of the room and say, is anybody who hasn't spoken, does anyone want to add anything? You can bring out one of the things that they've said and say what other people think of that. You could also, if you need to, call a break. If it this won't always work, but if the timing seems right, like let's just all take a break, get some water, we can go to the bathroom. That might be a time, if it's really happening a lot, pull the person aside and say, I appreciate that you're so passionate about this, but we have a limited amount of time, and so it'd be nice if we heard from some other voices. So that can be awkward. Like I always feel badly, like I really kind of don't want to do that, but it also, you have to think about, like, you feel badly for all the other people who are not getting to talk or who aren't getting to hear from other people if there's one person who's talking all the time.
Yeah, I think for me, this one is the hardest one as a facilitator, because it does come from such a good place. Mm-hmm. Generally, people are so excited about what you have to talk about that they just want to share more and more. So it can feel like you're shutting down someone who's enthusiastic. But it is really important to start off. Joy talked about a lot of those great techniques, and it's important. It's part of your job, and that uncomfortable job occasionally as a facilitator, to implement some of these things. On a similar note, the chronic interrupter. Sometimes the same person as the person who is talking quite a lot. One of the ways you can head this one off ahead of time is by talking ahead about active listening. That could be one of your agreements. It could be just one of the things you start the discussion off as. It's important to us that we actively engage with and listen to the person who is talking in a given moment, and wait to have our say until they're done. We did a number of community conversations around the 1970s a couple of years ago. And we would ask, is that microphone? If you're holding the microphone, you're the one talking. And you can do you maybe pass a copy of the book around or something. If you are holding the book, you are the person talking. That can also be a good physical thing. If you have the person who's been talking a while, okay, it's someone else's turn with the book now. and that can be a tough balance to make sure that doesn't feel doesn't feel condescending, but it can also be if you have a shared group agreement around that at the beginning, it can avoid that talking over cacophony kind of thing that can happen sometimes in a facilitator thing, and intervene directly, said, hi, can we please be patient and listen carefully to what so-and-so is saying, and then you'll have a chance to respond when they're done. Please be, you can also step up a level. Please be patient, listen. Let's see if your point, you change your mind after hearing the rest of what so-and-so has to say. Or if you want to respond more directly to what they have to say when they've finished their thoughts. If if things keep going and you've tried to assert your authority a little bit, you can sort of head off the interrupter. If someone else is talking, immediately after following them, you can say, thanks for what they just shared. Does anyone else agree or disagree with that? So that your interrupter doesn't feel the need to jump in right away. This is a place where your own body language can come into play a little bit. If you look at people who you can read the room. Sometimes there are people who sort of tip forward and lean forward a little bit. They want to say something, but they're feeling shut down by that other person. This is a point where you can invite them with your body language. You can look at them. You can directly sort of, as you're saying that, does anyone else have something to share? You can look at the person that you think has something to share and say. So that's, one of the ways that you can read and work with the room. I also often, after a couple of sort of head reroutings, a chronic interrupter or chronic talker will usually be then self-aware and realize what they're doing. If you name the behavior, then they'll usually, oh shoot, that's what I'm doing. Okay, I'll back off a little bit. So I think we get worried about these people, but they are coming from a good place. They're coming from a passionate place, and they very often self-correct if you assert a little bit of authority, if you don't just let the discussion sort of have a complete free-for-all. This is a moment where a light touch can really go a long way.
I think I referenced this earlier too, but I think libraries draw lonely people sometimes. They draw kind of eccentric people, and I think every library where I've worked, there's been somebody who it's pretty obvious that they just need to be talking. They just need someone to listen to them, and I have great compassion for that. But then it really helps to remind myself that to have compassion for all the other people there too. That although I do feel that we're meeting some sort of community need for this person by being there and having them have a chance to talk to other people, we're not meeting the needs of the other people there if it's this one person's chance to do that. So that kind of helps me remind myself not to be too soft about not encouraging someone not to dominate the conversation. Moving on to silent types, it's important to remember there are a lot of different reasons people are silent. It might be they're perfectly confident and quiet and want to be silent because they just want to listen and sort of draw it all in. It may be that they want to say something and feel like it's other people are talking too much or too loudly or too often, and it's just hard for them to get their word in. So it's very helpful in those moments to do, does anyone else do that? Does anyone else have anything to add kind of thing, to do the eye contact. I love that idea of as you're saying that, making eye contact with the person who you saw maybe moving, squirming a little bit in their chair, looking as if they have something to say. I think it's also important to be, to set a tone though where it's okay. It's like the person doesn't need to feel self-conscious if they haven't said anything at all. So always make that voluntary. Don't if somebody hasn't spoken, it doesn't seem like they want to. You don't want it to be like in high school when the teacher called on everyone and made people talk even if they didn't want to. That's not the point here. That we're not trying to give them public speaking experience. If they want to be silent, be respectful of that. And along with that, sometimes the conversation might stop, and it might be because people are thinking, and you just kind of need to sit with that for a while. That can feel awkward, but sometimes great conversation will come out of that afterwards if people have had a minute or something to sort of process, and there doesn't always have to be speaking.
Yeah, this one is really hard for me as a facilitator because I so want there to be active conversation at all times. But it works really well sometimes to just let the room be quiet for a moment or two. And sometimes it can absolutely fit the tone of the conversation. We did a community conversation 2 or 3 years ago following a screening of the Ken Burns a section of the Ken Burns Vietnam documentary. And the people in our conversation were, quite a few of them were Vietnam veterans, many of whom had trouble relating their experiences or talking about their experiences. So that was a conversation with a lot of long pauses and a lot of long silences that were really necessary to the conversation, and they really helped create a more rich conversation than just a lively, upbeat conversation about Vietnam, which just not have worked on so many levels. It would have been really inappropriate, frankly. But that was a really good one where they were just a minute or 30 seconds at a time of just calm silence, and then someone else would feel comfortable and okay, like they could speak up. So it can be okay to let that silence. We're not saying like let the room be just dull for 5 solid minutes while everyone shifts uncomfortably and stares at each other. That's definitely the moment to step in with, all those prepared questions and redirects that we talked about earlier. But this one, like I said, is really hard for me as a facilitator, but it can be really important and can really be a crucial tool in creating a good conversation.
I think that's a good moment to actually look at like your phone or a watch or something to actually have a sense of what the real time is, because like 30 seconds of silence can feel like, if you're not looking, it can feel like, were we just silent for like 5 minutes?
Yeah.
Because it's really hard to have perspective on that. So, as a facilitator, in a subtle way, you'll glance at your watch so you're actually timing, like, a moment of silence really should be a moment, not more or less.
Yeah. Yeah, that can be useful for sure. So, when you're ready for that silence to end or to move on, keeping a conversation going. How do you feel about specific thing, or what do you think about specific thing? You can also solicit responses to something that someone just said. If someone says something and then the room hangs for a little bit, you can also insert yourself. I found it really interesting that so-and-so talked specifically about water quality concerns with their own stream. Does anyone else have that experience? Does anyone else have those concerns? Or, in my backyard or on my road, they recently redirected the bridge or something like that to make, and I'm a little worried about the wildlife in that area. You can solicit responses in that way. You can draw parallels to have people draw parallels to their own lives. Has anyone else experienced this? Has anyone else driven down that new road? What did you think about it? Or has anyone else experienced whatever it is you're talking about? We'd love for you to feel comfortable sharing your story. We often, the improv rule is always say yes and. Always keep that conversation going. Don't shut it down by saying, well, that's not right. Your job as a facilitator is always to be the yes and person in the room. Yes, I hear what you said. I think it's wonderful. What else? What's next? And you just a gentle touch sometimes can be a really effective tool. And then sometimes that may be all you need, and they're off for another 20 minutes. Again, it really depends on the group. So we're sort of at a point now where we're going to move on to our next section, and I want to just review Jason's questions and make sure that we answered them. I'm going to switch us back over to that section and just put them up. Some of the best ways to engage participants when things appear to be heading towards impasse or disagreement, how to invite others to share, and what statements can be used. I think we covered some of those. Redirects are great, but also if participants are heading towards a disagreement, in some ways that's kind of okay. Again, if they just can't agree on the best way to preserve the downtown, that's, they've had the conversation. I think it's, we had the question come up in our last webinar when people get personal about the things that they're saying. They get really heated and they can get personal and they can get in someone else's face. It's important that it's also okay to sort of end a moment and to move on. If things get truly, truly hateful or anything like that, it's also okay to sort of separate someone else and say, you know what, it's not okay. This is not a moment. We're not personally attacking other people in this conversation. We're having a conversation with each other, a respectful dialogue. We're not just attacking. It's really hard to do, but also really important to do because, again, it's part of that making people feel welcome in your space and in the conversation. Do you have anything you wanted to add, Joy, to that?
Just again to reiterate that there is no right answer to these, and that sometimes, that maybe your perspective will be changed by somebody's comments tonight, but not necessarily. And that, these are questions that have been going on for hundreds of years in our state, and they will continue to be. And again, I think it's really important to name it. I mean, that was one of the suggestions that came up in the answer to that question, to name that it feels like it's getting personal, and we really are not here to, personally attack each other. We're trying to be respectful of each other.
So, yeah, it's hard, but again, necessary. So the follow-up to that one is, do you invite others by asking what they think to include all groups? Do you ask what they think about what was just referenced? Any and all of the above. Sometimes you can quickly diffuse if there's a moment that's getting a little heated or uncomfortable between two people. You can pull something out of what they just said that's a productive thing that they just said. What I heard was some concerns about water, again, water quality. Does anyone else have a well that they're worried about right now or something like that? You can pull a thread out of that, toss it back to the other members of the group. Again, this can be a body language one. If you're indicating, hey, I'd like someone else to, to weigh in.
A time to say, what do others think about this? Or can we hear from somebody who hasn't spoken yet? That's a good line, and people can choose to step in or not.
Yeah, I love that. Can you hear from anyone else who hasn't spoken yet? Because boy, that gets the message across very clear.
Yeah.
It gives the opportunity to people, and it also is a very effective, if you've already spoken, not now. Yeah. It's a very gentle sort of way to say, nope, you're done for now, which sometimes people need. All right. Just a final couple additional tips for you.
So it's a lot of the things that we've already talked about, just being respectful and trying to hear from everybody, avoiding absolute phrases, and remembering that, again, there is no right answer to this. Try not to avoid language like, well, the right answer, or the good way to do it, or, the smart people think, or, basically to try to be, as the facilitator, somewhat neutral, and you're facilitating, you're not necessarily participating in the same way as you might want to with your own personal opinions. And then the number 2, ask for last thoughts, final comments, unresolved issues. This is one that will sometimes bring up some people that haven't said anything yet. And it might also be that lovely moment where someone says, I was thinking this thing, but now that I've listened to this conversation, I'm thinking of it in a different way. That's a lovely thing to hear. You can even ask, does anybody feel that way? Does anybody feel differently about something that they thought about before? You can refer back to the book, bring them back to the, some of the way that the book wraps up, or sort of a quotation from the book that they might want to bring with them. Let's see, what else? Other additional tips that you can think of? Or if people want to add them in the chat.
I think this is a good moment for that to provide a bridge for them to whatever is next for you. If you can say something like, hey, if you enjoyed this conversation, we have another book discussion group that's going on, or we have another program coming up on a similar topic, or if you really want to keep thinking deeply about these issues, come in and chat with our reference librarians, and they may have some more reading suggestions for you. This can be a really good moment to capture that enthusiasm and then bridge it to other things that you do, other things that you offer, and make sure you keep coming back. This is the place where we want to hear from you, kind of thing. So
some facilitators will actually go around the room and, similar to at the beginning, have each person do you want to say anything in closing? Give them the chance to do that. Again, if you do that, make it voluntary. Someone doesn't have to be able to sum up everything that just happened in the last hour and a half.
So final thoughts. So we've been talking a lot today about the fact that we're doing this webinar as part of a summer of programming related to the book that VHS is publishing. You know, there's a lot of other programs this could be applicable to. We thought we'd give you all a moment to brainstorm a little bit. Are there any other conversations that you want to have within your community? Any other types of programs you think you could apply these principles to? We'll give you a little bit while we are sort of wrapping up to go ahead and type those in the box, and we'll share them with the group for everyone else to get ideas. If you don't have any and you want to keep thinking about it for the rest of the day, that's totally okay too. Just to address the question real quick, could you repeat that nice way of saying, nope, you're done? I had to put the phone down to help the courier. What we were suggesting was saying, thanks for sharing. Could we hear from, we'd like to hear from people who haven't spoken yet. That sort of is a way of closing off people who have said a fair bit already and inviting others to speak. So again, if you have any other, I'd love to use this to have a conversation about X or Y or apply this to others, go ahead and type them into that box and we will round them up at the end. We're going to move into sort of wrapping up our program today. If you're inspired by this to host your own community conversation, that's terrific. As we've said, we're doing this as part of a summer of programming, vermonthistory.org/community-conversations. Downloadable program guide that includes, we're hoping is useful to people who have never done a program before of any kind, which I suspect is not most of you, but you never know. Right on up to providing some tips for people who do programs all the time. It includes book discussion questions specific to this book, which again is Repeopling Vermont, The Paradox of Development in the 21st Century by Paul Searls. It also includes a typed out handout version of a lot of what we've covered in this webinar. So you can also have that as a quick ready reference, but again, I will also be sharing these slides with participants in the webinar for you going forward. So head to that, and the last page of that is, okay, yes, I think this is great. I'd love to talk about this in my own community. There are very clear and easy steps for you to take, how to invite the author to speak, how to get access to the copies of the books that the Vermont Department of Libraries has made it available through interlibrary loan, how to sort of let us know that you're having your conversation so that we can, both Vermont Libraries and Vermont Historical Society can trumpet your program far and wide and give you a little bit of additional boost in PR. So go and check that out if you are interested.
And a lot of the information in the guide is relevant to other programs as well. So there's like a sample evaluation in there. There's some tips for promoting your program ahead of time. So, you know, it'll apply to this program, but you could also use it sort of as a template for programming in general.
Yep. Yep. We'll try to make it as useful as possible. If you have any feedback on it, let us know. So, yeah, speaking of practicing good evaluation, thank you so much for joining us today. I want to say that this webinar software, as well as the Summer of Programming, was sponsored very kindly by a grant from the Vermont Humanities Council, who are terrific people and a terrific organization. So thanks to them for making this possible. There's my contact information and Joy's contact information, and we will be receiving an email shortly with just a link to a quick Google form that you can fill out to tell us what you thought about the webinar today, and we would love to hear from you. Anything else that we should wrap up with?
Just if any of you are in the certificate program, you do get CE credit for being at this webinar, so I will take note of any of you from the attendance list, if that's helpful to anyone.
Great. And we didn't get any ideas for programs, but we hope you keep turning them over in your head and think of other things that you can do with your communities, other conversations that you think it's important to have within your communities, and go forth and do good things. Thank you so much, everyone. We've got a couple of people typing, so I want to make sure you get your last say in before we close. You are welcome. Great.
Excellent. Well, thank you all for attending.
All right. Great. Thank you all so much. Again, this is available, will be available for reviewing at future dates if you want to listen to our lovely voices for another hour in the future. you will receive a link in your email so you can review it. Thank you everyone again, and you have a wonderful Monday.